In 1960, Ho Chi Minh, Vietnamese communist leader, set the history of his country onto a new path. After the defeat of French rule and the division of Vietnam into Communist North and Democratic South, Ho aimed to reunite the country under his communist rule through political agitation. Realizing that with the support of the United States, the Southern government could resist this pressure, in 1960, Ho restarted the war. For the next 15 years, Vietnam was to be convulsed by violent conflict and the fabric of American society shaken to its foundations. Now, the war was no longer a struggle of liberation from French colonialism. Vietnam became a battlefield of the Cold War, where communism confronted the free world. Ho's policy had been to exploit the deep religious and political tensions in South Vietnamese society. The mass of ordinary Vietnamese people were ancestor worshippers and Buddhist. They felt themselves the victims of an oppressive Catholic elite, of a small clique that monopolized power with a web of corruption and nepotism. Elections in democratic South Vietnam were dubious. Power depended on friendship and family connection. Authority in South Vietnam was too often dictatorial, policy formed by personal whim and ego. South Vietnamese society, a police state. Many ordinary South Vietnamese felt powerless and voiced their dissatisfaction in demonstrations, protests, and strikes. In protest of this dictatorial regime, Buddhist monks were to commit horrific public suicides by burning. To this chaos, Ho Chi Minh added military action, guerrilla war in city and country, seeking to subvert, undermine, and ultimately destroy the authority and the credibility of the South Vietnamese government. To counter this threat, the Army of South Vietnam was lavishly supplied with equipment and expertise by U.S. military advisors. Any military only reflects the society from which it's drawn. John F. Kennedy warned that only the South Vietnamese could win or lose the war. The soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, were trained to be American soldiers. Vietnamese trained to fight against other Vietnamese. The grafting of Vietnamese soldiers to the weapons of the foreigner, to the thinking of the foreigner, was to become central to shaping the effectiveness of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The adaptation of the Vietnamese to American thinking came hand in hand with the use of massive material resources of war. Troops who by nature were fighters for their land, historically the defenders of their farms and homes against outsiders, their battlefield, their own paddies, streets, and villages, were now introduced to the high technology and mechanics of war, to the helicopters that swept them above that same landscape. The gain in mobility and striking power was traded for the loss of intimacy with the landscape and people. The uniforms were those of the foreign ally, the foreign power. The Vietnamese that were on the other side, the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters, wore the clothing of the peasant. The ultimate strength or weakness of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was to depend on how well its soldiers could grow to fit their uniforms. American supplies of war, both material goods and economic aid, had supported the South since the division of the country in 1954. In providing this flow of goods, South Vietnam was hard put to ingest the immense flow of the material support given by the U.S. Ships would queue for weeks in the seaways of Vietnam, waiting to disgorge their cornucopia of war. The first men had been added to these exports of war in 1960. These were the advisors and logistic support troops. In scenes reminiscent of World War II, U.S. troops crowded onto ships for the journey across the Pacific, a voyage that would last nearly 3 weeks. With the baggage of history, of hindsight, of all that Vietnam has come to mean, it's difficult to recall and realize the spirit of confidence and optimism in which those soldiers were sent. The early black and white images of disciplined and clean-cut troops seem at odds with the Vietnam myth of the rock and roll war, of disaffected, mutinous, and demoralized Americans. These are scenes of the early 1960s, yet the casual observer could place them in 1945. The contrast with that myth, with the legend of Vietnam, is a measure of the way in which the coming and expanding war was to affect American society at the very deepest of levels. The America of 1963 was the America that had grown up in the confidence and security of the Eisenhower years. It was the America that believed in the vision of John F. Kennedy. The soldiers crowding the decks of these ships had unshakable confidence in America as the strongest country on earth, where anything was possible. It was an America aggressively convinced of the rightness of its fight to preserve freedom against the spread of an inherently evil communism. The nature of American support changed after 1964. In an incident shrouded in conspiracy theory and rumor, American warships were reported as fired upon by the North Vietnamese. The outrage this incident provoked gave political impetus to the deployment of combat forces. In reaction to this provocation, United States soldiers and Marines were deployed no longer just to advise and train, but to fight as combatants directly against the Viet Cong.
Hi, I'm Army Specialist Zach Johnson, and this is the Psychedelic Music Show on the big AFVN, Channel 54, Saigon.
This was a large and powerful body of armed men drawn from a society that was not used to defeat. It was an army that held its enemy in a contemptuous disregard as a guerrilla army, as a band of poorly equipped irregular soldiers. The American soldier of the early 1960s would have had no doubt as to their duty to their country. The aims and beliefs of America would have been their aims and beliefs. They would have known with a certainty that Vietnam was a country that needed to be saved. The Army went into action with confident self-belief that it was entering a war where the might of the most powerful economic and military power in the world was pitted against a guerrilla army, where failure was not a possibility. The ranks of armed men with strange habits, language, and uniform who were to flood into South Vietnam in increasing numbers would have appeared to the Vietnamese people as another foreign army in a long succession of foreign armies. In the big picture of Vietnam's history, the army of the Emperor of China, the Emperor of Japan, the French president, and the American president all merged as one. This new army brought to its South Vietnamese ally foreign thinking and foreign ways. America aimed to win this war on its terms with its weapons. The enemy was to approach the conflict in a deeply different way. The confrontation was not just to be a test of American strength, but of American culture. The impending tragedy was that this was not foreseen by these men or their leaders. American forces were not simply in Vietnam to fight and destroy the communists. Consistent with fighting for a way of life, they aimed to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. In the rural areas of Vietnam, which had suffered from the neglect of the colonial administration and the callous disinterest of urban-centered South Vietnamese regimes, the U.S. aimed at improving the quality of life for the ordinary Vietnamese through projects aimed at developing infrastructure and welfare. American doctors would bring improved health care to remote villages. Those villagers would be the targets of the Viet Cong, who aimed to supplant and replace the South Vietnamese government, organizing the peasants into a communist society. The problem, as ever, was that when at the end of the day the Americans left, the Viet Cong would emerge from hiding and reassert communist authority. The Vietnam War had many battlegrounds. It was an urban war, fought in the city streets of the South. A war in which the Viet Cong used the weapons of the terrorist. The images of helicopters circling over a claustrophobic jungle in which infantry struggles with unseen Viet Cong is but part of the Vietnam story. Indiscriminate terrorist bombing of areas frequented by Americans and the cold-blooded assassination of South Vietnamese government officials were ruthlessly employed. For the Americans, it created a war with no clearly defined front line. Who was friend? Who was the enemy? The war was a rural war. The classic infantry action was the search and destroy mission, a patrol through the countryside to seek out, challenge, and engage the Viet Cong. In this landscape, communist forces sought to avoid battle on American terms. Only fighting in the way the communists wanted. Sniper attack, sudden ambush, booby trap, and landmine were constant threats. The set-piece conventional battle where the other side wore a uniform was rare. A demonstration of the massive material advantages of the American forces were fire support bases. The heavily fortified compounds acted as bases for artillery that could be called to support an infantry unit on search and destroy. The fire support base was also used as bait to provoke the Viet Cong to attack, draw the communists into a battle where the guerrillas could be annihilated. The fire support base could be established in any terrain. The enormous material advantage of the U.S. forces meant that this heavy artillery support could be brought into the most remote and inaccessible area with ease. No foot soldier on patrol was isolated or alone and could call in massive help. Viet Cong tactics were not to fight the war by the American rules and make this striking power irrelevant. The Viet Cong aimed for control of the countryside through intimidation and indoctrination by kidnapping and murder of anyone linked to the South Vietnamese government. Rather than face heavy attack, the Viet Cong would always retreat before a great weight of fire could be summoned. U.S. soldiers would be attacked in a brief flurry of automatic fire. A mine might explode on a remote path. A lone sniper might fire a single shot. Too often, the sighting of the enemy was just a fleeting glimpse of a distant figure, the weight of heavy shells to fall upon shadows and footprints, places where the enemy had been. If a weapon of war can stand as an icon for Vietnam, it is the helicopter taking off or landing amidst a swirl of dust and noise. It was in Vietnam that the helicopter realized its full potential as a weapon of war. The helicopter enabled U.S. and South Vietnamese forces to quickly concentrate, enveloping and surrounding the Viet Cong. Supplies were easily delivered, reinforcing American material advantages. This power to project overwhelming force meant that when the Viet Cong were brought to battle, the result was a heavy communist defeat with huge loss of life compared to American forces. The helicopter came in many variants, as troop transport large and small, as gunship, and a mover of the largest equipment. The definitive Vietnam helicopter was the UH-1, the Huey. The distinctive whine of its turbine and the beat of its rotor, the iconic sounds of Vietnam. Helicopters were mass-produced and employed in huge numbers. The successful armies of history never neglect and casually dispose of their traditions, instead adapting the best of their history to new weapons and techniques. New types of fighting unit were created by the helicopter. The American Air Cavalry blended the mobility and striking power of the helicopter with the aggressive tradition of cavalry as elite soldiers. The assault from helicopter with rocket and machine gun brought a new dimension of striking power to ground conflict. The qualities that made the helicopter such a devastating weapon in the military war were its weaknesses in the political war. The helicopter enabled U.S. forces to operate from safe, secure bases, far from the villages and fields where the struggle for the loyalty of the population was fought. U.S. troops could go home in the evening. When the Americans flew away, villagers knew that perhaps in just hours, the Viet Cong would return and once more take charge. Who was the enemy? Who were the Viet Cong? The Viet Cong could be anywhere and nowhere, hiding amongst ordinary people in fields and secret tunnels. Mao Zedong said that the revolutionary soldier should move amongst the people as a fish swims through water. This is exactly what the Viet Cong did. Not only were they invisible, but the ordinary Vietnamese villager could have little faith in the power of the U.S. as a defense or protection. The Viet Cong tactic was to avoid fighting unless on Viet Cong terms, and then aim to ambush, inflicting casualties that America would find unacceptable, and then retreat, melting away into the countryside. The Viet Cong fought, lived, educated, and indoctrinated amongst the population. Supplied by communist China and Russia, weapons were carried hundreds of miles by hand or bicycle along the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of paths and trails through the deepest and remotest jungle wilderness. Their logistics, the inversion, the negative of the American. The American Air Force concentrated much of its effort attempting to break this slender but tough network of supply lines with bombing attacks on remote clearings and depots, convoys of trucks deep in the jungle, deep in the north. The U.S. never won total air supremacy, never completely suppressed the communist air defenses. Americans were shot down. The fate of downed pilots was to be long years of strict captivity. A potent weapon in this war against the communist supply routes were the gunships.
In the Central Highlands, AFB and man is really fun.
Gunships were adapted from transport planes and carried a small battery of artillery with fast-firing automated cannon, capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. These aircraft were too slow and vulnerable to operate during the day and would fly at night to make their attacks. Again, directed to their targets by advanced surveillance technology, a network of listening devices deep in the jungle. The gunship would lock on in a tight circle about its target and saturate the area with a deluge of shell fire. The gunships preyed on the convoys of trucks the Viet Cong would send at night through narrow forest tracks. Nothing would survive in the target area. Truly a weapon of numbers, it fired at map references, its effectiveness determined by mathematics. The potency of this weapon was limited by accuracy of intelligence. Too often, that storm of fire was to burst upon empty jungle. The U.S. Air Force had perhaps the longest involvement of American combat forces in Vietnam. Bombing missions were made long before ground troops set foot in the country and long after the last ground troops had left. U.S. aircraft struck deep into North Vietnam, attacking targets of strategic importance. Aircraft dropped propaganda and sprayed defoliant to destroy the jungle that hid their enemy. Air war is often described more than any other type of conflict by numbers, by statistics, as a war of graphs, charts, and tables. During the years of American action in Vietnam, the Air Forces dropped thousands upon thousands of tons of high explosive. The U.S. Air Force lost 2,257 aircraft. 2,118 airmen were killed. Aircrew accounted for 586 captured or missing. The logic of the air war, the war of sorties flown, tons of ordnance dropped and of targets attacked, can stand as a metaphor and symbol for the whole of American strategy. Despite the talk of winning hearts and minds, the real strategy was one of arithmetic and mathematics, a logical equation that massive, overwhelming, numerical and material superiority must add up to victory. It was a logic that reflected an American belief that the war could be fought and won far away from the political ground of both Vietnam and America. The most spectacular demonstration of air power was the use of the B-52 strategic bomber to deliver huge loads of bombs, devastating an area with one single attack. History has shown that the use of air power, however massive and overwhelming, does not win and keep victory. There must be men on the ground where it hurts, where there is danger, in order to realize victory. Men must close with the enemy, see him, hear him. Soldiers to occupy ground which has been won, to prevent the enemy returning once the planes and helicopters have gone. Over the years of the war, starting from under 1,000 Americans in 1960, the numbers rose to an eventual peak of more than 500,000 in the early months of 1969. As the war escalated, the position of the Americans grew militarily stronger, but politically weaker. The draft conscription forced more and more Americans to Vietnam. History has shown that wars like that fought in Vietnam, wars fought far from home, with no question of national survival, are not won by the use of reluctant conscripts. Soldiers who want nothing more than to get home, finishing their time, who see no purpose to the fighting. The states that have fought such wars successfully, empires like that of Britain and ancient Rome, use professional volunteer armies or cynical mercenaries, soldiers who love their job. Again, this was the political ground that the Viet Cong had forced the Americans onto. As more and more of America sent men to Vietnam and more families bid farewell to sons, brothers, and lovers reluctant to go, and more of these young men stood the chance of a wound, the pressure on the American government grew. The basic American strategy to search and destroy, to find the Viet Cong and annihilate them, was a defensive strategy. Operations were regarded as successful in that this or that number of Viet Cong were killed or captured. The idea of a knockout blow, a strike at the heart of communist power, was restricted to bombing. Bombing campaigns, which for much of the war were restrained by the politics of the greater picture of the Cold War with Russia and China. The communists could take the heavy losses. As long as there was always another ambush, another attack that took American lives, there was no victory for the Americans. The feel was of a war that simply carried on, with no end in sight. It is a truth of armed conflict that political leaders seek to avoid. In war, people are killed, wounded, and scarred for life. Throughout history, each new conflict has its own pattern of weaponry and combat, for each its own particular peril for the soldiers who fight. The Vietnam War was a war where the danger for the American soldier lay in the firefight, the exchange of fire with the enemy. In World War II, it was artillery and shell fire that was the chief threat. Since 1945, development and invention in the design of the infantryman's weapon, the invention of automatic weapons, such as the Russian AK-47, meant that the ordinary soldier was a far more dangerous enemy than before. Much is made of the danger to the infantryman of the traditional Vietnamese weapons, the punji stake, the bamboo spears. Their reputation was myth, being responsible for no deaths and a tiniest fraction of wounds. Vietnamese casualties were far higher. Over the course of the war, thousands upon thousands of Vietnamese were to die. A tenth of the 2.5 million Americans who served in Vietnam became a casualty of some sort. More than 300,000 were wounded. "75,000 veterans were severely disabled. "58,169 died. This was a war in which treatment of the wounded was of a higher standard than ever before. 99% of wounded soldiers who reached a hospital survived. The helicopter was the savior of lives. Medical evacuation helicopters flew more than 500,000 missions, airlifting over 900,000 patients, both American and Vietnamese. Wounded soldiers could expect to be in hospital in less than 1 hour. The U.S. Navy played a major part in the war. The long coastline of Vietnam, open to deep blue water, invited classic naval operations. At times, as many as 5 carriers launched attacks. A surreal world where the pilots returned home to the carrier every night with little knowledge of the country they had flown over and attacked. Battleship New Jersey fired its 16-inch guns in classic bombardment of North Vietnam. These were classic blue water actions, familiar to the sailors of World War II. However, the iconic image of the U.S. Navy in Vietnam is that of what became known as the Brown Water Navy. In the maze of the narrow waterways of the Mekong Delta in the far south of Vietnam, supplies were smuggled in by traditional sampan and other small craft to aid the Viet Cong in their attempt to control the Delta region. U.S. Coast Guard cutters were drafted in to supplement the Navy's efforts to cut the flow of communist supplies. Again, the problem was how to tell friend from enemy. If the Navy had an equivalent of the Huey, it was the PBR, the Patrol Boat River. These small craft brought the Navy close into the war, eye to eye with the enemy. In contrast to the floating cities of steel, the small boats built of plastic were able to operate in water that would not reach a man's knee. They were used in vast numbers. As many as 2,000 were built. The Mekong Delta was an important area of Vietnam. It was the rice basket of the country, providing essential staple food. For it to fall to the communists would be a major blow to the South Vietnamese. The Delta was a complex network of changing river courses, where winding saltwater creeks and estuaries crisscrossed ruler-straight canals and drains. In the PBR, the Navy continued the ancient and historic tradition of boat actions by armed sailors confronting their enemy in a series of fiercely fought skirmishes. In 1968, during the Lunar New Year holiday, what in Vietnam is called Tet, a time when all Vietnamese want to be at home, celebrating with their families, the North mounted a massive offensive against the South. The North Vietnamese Army staged a conventional invasion across the border. At the same time, Viet Cong guerrilla units made attacks within the southern cities. The surprise was near complete, and for days, chaos ruled. The Vietnamese and American forces reeled and desperately reorganized. In the cities, the Viet Cong savagely rounded up and summarily killed those they thought their enemies. The most significant event was the attack by a fanatical 14-strong suicide squad of Viet Cong upon the United States Embassy. Their attack was a complete failure, but the assault happened under the eyes of the media. The pictures from Saigon seemed to show that after all the fighting, after all the pronouncements of imminent victory from the generals and politicians of the U.S., that the war could not be won, that the Viet Cong could carry the war into the very center of U.S. power. The images of Saigon, of the street fighting, of the refugees, seemed to show America in the throes of defeat. The Tet Offensive was an attempt by the Communists to end the war at a stroke. After the initial shock, the Americans and South Vietnamese rapidly regrouped and repelled the Communists with powerful counterattacks, resulting in a complete military defeat for the North, with the deaths of more than 39,000 Viet Cong, compared to just 5,000 Americans. A key battleground of Tet was the siege of Khe Sanh. The regular North Vietnamese army encircled and attacked the U.S. base. The aim was to repeat Dien Bien Phu, force a major surrender of large numbers of U.S. troops that would knock America out of the war. After 66 days, the Americans defeated the North Vietnamese. The Communist defeat during Tet was so great a loss of equipment and men that their ability to carry on the war was crippled. However, the political effect upon the will of the American people was utter devastation. It was the beginning of the end. The message from Saigon convinced the American people the war was lost. No one believed the claims of U.S. commanders that Tet was a victory. The pressure on the American government was immense. Any loss of confidence in the communist camp that may have arisen from the defeat was relieved by the massive reaction in the United States. The losses of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong lives balanced out by Americans that were calling for an end to the war. The young of America were swept up into the climate of feverish rebellion, that spirit of 1968 that was filling the streets of the world with protesting young people. Vietnam was just one more issue that separated generations in alienated mutual incomprehension. The turmoil in the United States was compounded by a hardening of world opinion against America. The U.S. had no friends. The effect on the U.S. presidential election of 1968 will long be the subject of controversy and argument. The new president, Richard Nixon, was elected promising to find a way out for America. The policy was to make the war a Vietnamese war, withdrawing Americans from the very front line. Nixon's predecessor, Johnson, had already secretly initiated the idea of talks. The negotiations took place in Paris, the capital of Vietnam's former colonial masters. Time was on the communist side. The Paris peace talks were to drag on and on. Communist delegates miring the talking with obscure obfuscation, turning over and over again the details, arguing about the shape of tables at which talks were to be made. As time passed and fighting in which Americans died continued, political pressure was increasing to end the war, to bring American soldiers home. The period following Nixon's election was a period of American withdrawal and disengagement from Vietnam, of negotiation and betrayal. It has been described as the time when the newsreel began to run backwards. The numbers of American ground combat forces reached its highest level in January 1969, and then promptly began a steep fall which no events in the war could halt. But against this background of reverse, the war in many ways enlarged. The war spread into the neighboring Indochina country of Cambodia. The communists had used the neutrality of this country to secretly bring in supplies and troops free from American intervention. To convince the communists, the war was carried with air and ground forces, striking into the communist safe haven. The clear goal was to extract America from the war. To those American troops who were still fighting the war, who still went out each day to risk death and saw friends die, the knowledge that there was no support at home was a blow to morale harder than any Viet Cong weapon. It is during this time, as the American Army began to feel its abandonment, it is from these last months that the stories of ill discipline, the total loss of morale, and of near mutiny arise. The ordinary soldier now thought only of getting out and going home, desperately counting the days to the end of service. The words of the ancient Chinese philosopher of war, Sun Tzu, writing 25 centuries before, gain new and powerful meaning. Break the will of the enemy to fight and accomplish the true objective of war. Cover with ridicule the enemy's tradition. Exploit and aggravate the frictions within the enemy's country. Turn the young against the old. The supreme excellence is not to win 100 victories in 100 battles. The supreme excellence is to defeat your enemies without ever having to fight. To say there was an uprising amongst the American people against their government is an oversimplification. Some who protested felt true moral revulsion to the war. Some were as traitors to their country, siding with the communists. Some were soldiers who felt betrayed by bad leadership and were not prepared to see others suffer. The war ignited that always present isolationism deep in the American mind, that foreign wars, always fought an ocean away, were of no concern. For every protester that felt active revulsion, there were Americans who simply felt that their leaders had betrayed their trust, lied in proclaiming a victory that was not happening, that was never to come. Those people simply believed America was better out of a war that could not be won. The newsreel ran backwards. A new word was added to the language. Vietnamization. An ugly word, a word that implies that Vietnamese people had let the American do all the fighting and all the dying. Vietnamization meant that the South Vietnamese were to take responsibility for the war. American involvement in the Vietnam War ended, playing to the same script as it began. President John F. Kennedy said that the Vietnam War was a war which only the South Vietnamese could win or lose, an idea that reflected the truth that even with massive American help, the South would need political strength and political cohesion to endure and prevail. Despite the acknowledgement of this truth, the military forces of Saigon had played a secondary role to that of the Americans in the fight against the communists. After the trauma that was Tet, this was to change. The South Vietnamese army was vastly and rapidly expanded. New formations raised and trained. The American forces became the providers of weapons, equipment which dated from World War II and from the days of French rule were replaced. The whole mechanical panoply of war, the artillery, the Hueys, the PBRs, the props with which the drama was played, were passed into the hands of the South Vietnamese forces. An immense transfusion of strength that made the forces of South Vietnam some of the strongest in the world. But the United States had created a Vietnamese paper tiger. The strategic challenge to the South was the same. The strategy pursued was still the failed strategy of attempting to destroy the Viet Cong. It was a strategy that could not convince the heart and the mind of the ordinary Vietnamese peasant that South Vietnam would ever be secure and a peaceful home, a place that could have a lasting, stable, and prosperous future. Finally, in January 1973, a deal was agreed. All American forces were to be withdrawn. However, all communist forces were allowed to remain where they were. It was a military truce, not a political settlement. No one disarmed, no borders were recognized, no elections were promised. The American government presented the deal as peace with honor. It did bring all prisoners home. The return of the men who had suffered so much for their country ended the last direct American interest in the fighting in Southeast Asia. The North Vietnamese had not treated their prisoners well. The returning POWs told stories of harsh treatment and deprivation. Many prisoners died of illnesses and disease. The effects of wounds were compounded. Some men had endured as much as 8 years of confinement and humiliation. With the return of those taken prisoners, there began a ruthless self-examination of American society on the motives for the war, the conduct of the war, a process of questioning and introspection that exists even to this day. It is possible that the spread of communism was frustrated in Southeast Asia. After the end of the war, communism spread no further than the countries of Indochina. In that end, the wider goals of American policy had been achieved. Nonetheless, the prisoners came home to a United States where the inability of American forces to decisively defeat the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese was seen as a warning and had a deep and profound impact upon the future history of the United States. The prisoners came to a country that had lost confidence in itself, to a country which, despite massive material strength, had failed to prevail. They returned to a home that had exuded optimism and positive belief in what could be achieved, a country that had crashed into self-doubt, cynicism, and internal division. The prisoners were home, and America had exited from the stage of the Vietnam tragedy. As those men returned to reunite with families and lovers, the last desperate act of the story of Vietnam remained to be played out. On the day that the war became completely Vietnamized, the faces of the people and soldiers of South Vietnam betrayed their deepest fears for the future. this was a world turned upside down. A world where a ceasefire was a time of continued and heavy fighting. In the desperate years that followed the ceasefire and the retreat of the American forces, the South Vietnamese faced and fought off a series of communist attacks. The formidable arsenal bequeathed by the United States was sabotaged by the fact that the South Vietnamese state did not have the political structure, the inherent strength to support modern armed forces. It was not the problem of acquiring weaponry or aircraft or the ability to understand operating instructions. Rather, it was the sad fact that South Vietnamese society was not capable of supporting a modern American-style army. It had learned nothing from the way an American democracy worked. The newsreel ran backwards. Once asked to stand alone, as pressure increased, the South Vietnamese society reverted to a harsh police state. In the years following the American withdrawal, the North continued its terrorist attacks and mounted a series of ever stronger invasions. The assaults from every direction created chaos and broke down the structure of everyday life in South Vietnam. The Communist allies, Russia and China, continued their support of the North. American promises to the South Vietnamese people to continue economic aid were broken. America promised to renew air attacks if the North invaded. Again, a promise that was broken. The Communists were able to wait, watching the South dying politically, collapsing economically, dying from within. The Southern population abandoned hope and had no will to resist. In the end, after the relentless guerrilla campaign, the deaths and subversion of the Viet Cong, an economically and politically bankrupt South Vietnam was crushed by a conventional invasion by the North Vietnamese Army. War is famously held to be a continuation of politics by other means. In the confusion of war, where events overtake the best plans of generals, where facts confound ideology, where luck causes a dramatic reversal of fortune, and the charisma of individuals overshadows the flow of ideas and the efforts of many, the political dimension of military conflict is easily obscured. The lesson to history, both present and future, is hidden. The message of the two wars in Southeast Asia is to teach us truly and convincingly that material superiority is not enough, that moral superiority, fighting on the side of the angels, of good and right, is not enough. The French were not militarily defeated by the Viet Minh. The United States were not defeated in battle by North Vietnam. A third world country did not overwhelm and overpower the most powerful military, industrial, and economic state in the world. It did not win because it proved that the communist way of life was better than the American. In the same way as the most devious and dishonest can fool a democracy, the communists did not outfight. They simply outpoliticked their enemies. The overwhelming fear that deaths may have been in vain that has led some to argue that the fall of communism in Europe and the development of Asian economies was somehow due to the Vietnam War, buying time in a battle in the Greater Cold War, is too simple a reading of the tangled weave of events and personalities that makes up the timeline of world history. To argue simply the American forces were betrayed by the media and that victory would have come in the end, in some vague way, by allowing the military to direct the war, fails to understand the complex political and military nature of the conflict. The French encountered an enemy whose identity was defined by struggle against invaders. the American encounters the same enemy and fails to heed the lessons of either recent or deep history. The Vietnam War is a real event still in the living recall of millions. Yet our memory of Vietnam is more mythologized, divorced from reality than many events far older from our more distant past. Those who do not understand their history are condemned to repeat it. The two wars hold out lessons to all that follow, to any that will listen. Be their aim to protect for good, to preserve freedoms, or to destroy in the dark light of an evil science. The Vietnam War is perhaps still too near to the present to be judged by the cold, truly dispassionate eye of history. Still a walking specter, haunting the darkest corners of the mind. The Vietnam War is, without question, one of the defining events that create the modern world. The lessons are there. It's the choice of the present and of the future, whether they are learned.